I mean, it's kind of like when you show somebody The Sixth Sense. Unless they've lived, under a rock, not Iraq, but a rock.
Gentlemen, let's broaden our minds.
Are they in the proper approach pattern for today?
Negative.
Hold the weapon! Now! Charge the lightning field.
Welcome back to Season 12 of the War Rocket Ajax podcast, broadcasting from the democratic Ameri-Mexicanadian enclave of His Eminence Commissar Lawrence, the Cable Gentleman.
All hail Lawrence.
Exactly. I'm James, and this is my co-host, Jakob.
Da?
Today we're discussing the geek culture genre of alternate history.
That is right, Tovarich.
My dad still claims to this day that he went to school with a Russian exchange student named Ivan Ofelich.
It could be possible.
Hey, all things are possible, and that's exactly what we're tackling today. Why do we ask what if when considering history? Because we all do. See, the course of human history, of world events, are kind of a big deal. Perhaps you've heard of this phenomenon, world events.
I've heard over our many years of podcasting.
I am confused as to where this accent is from. It's just a lot of Eastern Europe going on.
Sorry, what was I saying?
Whoa! Jake just teleported in from...
Hey!
Christopher Walken is here, ladies and gentlemen! Comrade Walken, welcome!
In Mother Russia. Watch, where's you?
We're alternate universe where Yakov Smirnoff was replaced by Christopher Walken. Oh man, that's a bit for like an open mic stand-up comedian if I've ever heard one.
I had to wear this joke up my ass.
I think it would go a little something like this. It's important to note that the weeds are tall here, so it's going to get easy to get a little lost. So we're going to start with the basics of the genre, some of the variations, examples, and even some recommendations, because it's actually one of my favorite fiction genres. I don't know why. I do know why, but it's like weird thing about how my brain works. But
No, dive in. Just give 2 minutes, like.
Sure, riff, man. Let's go.
We've been podcasting for over a decade, man.
The number one podcast in Ameri-Mexicanada, 12 years running.
We're taking it to the Mex.
Speaking of that, we do have to do Max Headroom.
We will do that.
Also, ironically, in Back to the Future 2. Max Headroom was.
Yeah, yeah.
He did the Pepsi commercial, remember?
Is that before or after Jaws 27?
Yes. After the Cubs win the World Series in 2015.
What?
Which is funny because the Royals won the World Series in 2015 and the Cubs won it the next year.
Crazy, man.
What a kooky world we live in.
Man, it's wild.
It's wild, man.
So yeah, well, what is it about the alternate history genre that really tweaks your knobs?
Or tweaks my diddle? I don't know. I'm fascinated by world building, and I really like his causality. I feel like time is a river in various other song lyrics. You think about the Mississippi, it's so big and so seemingly immutable that changing its course would take something so drastic as the earthquake in 1904 or whatever. But if you really look at it, all of the various things streaming down the river, a rock in one place or a tree falling in another changes its course, even if slightly, so the mighty river can very easily be tweaked and diddled. Like time.
She's so wet.
Oh man, it's real wet in here. And so I'm fascinated because one or two events, no matter how small, can change everything we know about how the world is. And I like finding out how we get to those places. What scenarios would facilitate an alternate world based just on one or two things being different in the world we live in currently, which is obviously a meritocracy of Ameri-Mexicanada, post-World War VII.
That was the best one.
That was one where we all decided to get along. It's like a boy and his dog. It starts out with, after World War V, and you're like, what the fuck are you talking about? You gotta give me something in between there. Anyway, all events, it's all causality. One thing leads to another, and you could get into chaos theory / complexity theory or the butterfly effect, which are all completely valid things to explore, but the idea behind this genre is mostly that the entirety of human history, or even world history, can pivot on one or two events, and if just tiny changes are made, the Challenger, whatever tiny flaw existed that caused that to explode, had that not happened, the world would be a completely different place. And we're going to get into some more examples of that, even specifically in the space race as we go along, because that is a fascinating aspect of it. So, alternate history, or alternative history, allo history, ALLO history, which is alt-hist, or AH, idiot, is a subgenre intersection of speculative fiction, which also encompasses science fiction, and historical fiction that is set in a world in which history has diverged from the established actual history of the world in which we live, if you believe in reality.
Negative. I am a meat popsicle.
Oh, like Stallone in Demolition Man?
I wonder who bought that.
Oh, the one from Planet Hollywood?
Yeah, it was up for sale recently.
Oh, was it really?
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, I hope it's... Well, no, Wesley Snipes doesn't have any money. He's not going to pay taxes on that purchase. I'll tell you that right now. It'd be funny if all of these things, the most important alternate history, would be about the movie Divergent. That'd be really interesting. No, it wouldn't, because that movie's not interesting.
No, it's not.
That movie sucks.
I like where your head's at. It just wound up in the toilet. That's the problem.
Like many Philip K. Dick adaptations. So we'll probably focus more on reality-based alt history rather than histories influenced by things like magic, even time travel, even though that gets sticky too, because sometimes the time travel affects the thing, and sometimes time travel is the POV that you're seeing the alternate history from, though it has no effect on it. You know, it's touch and go, but we're mostly going to focus on the main line.
Because a lot of those, especially with time travel, it's not as much about the world building and seeing how events played out different to affect things in a different way. It's just a setting that allows this plot to continue on, whether it's Marty jumping to the Old West or things have changed in the 2000s because of XYZ. It's more about the time travel and less about how things have changed.
Yeah. Ironically, alternatively, in that sense, the sub of that subgenre, oftentimes, if you deal with time travel, it's the time travel event or what have you that causes the divergence in the timeline or the change in historical events, which is not as interesting to me because then you're not dealing with how fragile our reality is. I mean, it's almost literally a deus ex machina to set up this, like you said, it's the backdrop, the setting for the story you're telling.
Yeah. There's a book series called The Axis of Time, where U.S. naval ships, modern U.S. naval ships, get transported into 1942, kind of like all over the place. And so you see how World War II events change and how like the global policy and technology, it all shifts because of that. But it's very unnatural because you're just using this time portal. What if we dropped this in here and what happens?
Right.
It's not as interesting to me in this particular genre.
Right. I completely agree because it's kind of dumbing it down. Well, not kind of. It's 100% dumbing it down because instead of like figuring out the social conditions, the randomness of certain events, the ripple effect of events that occur over the course of history, you're just dropping a MacGuffin.
Yeah, which doesn't mean that these stories can't be good or entertaining.
Oh,
or that
not
the
at
world
all.
building can't be strong.
Look at the final countdown, which is basically what you were just talking about.
Yeah, it can be cool. It's just not exactly what we're focusing on here.
No, and there's nothing wrong with those other streams of subgenre because they are rich and popular. Like His Majesty's Dragon, the one that became a movie with Pierce Brosnan. The King's Daughter, is that what it's called? The one where she's like a mermaid shows up in royal court and it changes everything. It's bad movies. I think it was called The King's Daughter, I think.
King's Daughter? Well, it does have Pierce Brosnan.
Yeah, it's based on a book, but movie sucks real hard. The idea is that it's the normal universe, except now there's a mermaid. The magical elements kind of ruin it. In the mainline version, there's nothing wrong with that subgenre. But to understand the entire thing, we're going to just focus on the core with Hilary Swank and Aaron Eckhart.
Feel free to throw up. I know I did.
Yeah, it's unobtainium all the way down.
The core, the most pivotal movie in the history of humankind. Now even you could laugh at that. So in just straight on alt history, like we're discussing, the course of events around the world in which they occupy is affected by real life possible scenarios that vary from what really occurred in our perceived reality. And it usually pivots around the world's most notable and consequential events. Though it doesn't have to be, it usually is these big world-changing events, i.e. The World Wars, the American Civil War, the space race, the assassination of JFK, the invasion of the New World by Columbus, that whole genocidal thing that nobody talks about. Now, this is often described as a subgenre of science fiction, which it is. But alternate history is a genre of fiction wherein the author speculates on, obviously, the course of history and how it could have changed by an event or multiple events, and how it had an outcome different from what really happened. This concept requires essentially, and this is rough, but it essentially requires three things. A point of divergence from the historical record before the time in which the author is writing. So I do not count 1984, for instance, because it was written in 1949. You know, that is a different genre.
But aren't you extrapolating out the same way? So, I mean, you're just going past the point when it came out, but I mean, the history is the same. Things change, X, Y, Z are different, and it just progresses on.
Well, but
isn't it kind of arbitrary between, like, if he called it 1947 or if he called it 1984?
That depends, honestly, and it's a valid question. But in 1984, what was the event that changed history? There wasn't one.
Well, it wasn't. Well, I mean, it's more about the events previous to 1984.
Yeah, but there is no event previous to 1984 either. Because in that book, it's about a dystopian future based on how things might go.
Right. I mean, it's not about finding that alternate history. It's about defining this world and its ramifications. A change in history has occurred, but what that isn't really the core.
Well, actually, we don't know that a change has occurred because it's written in 1949. It's set in 1984. So as far as we know, that's just history. You know what I mean? There is no previous history and then a change that we can compare to. In 1984, they say this is the future, period.
Gotcha. I think it's my modern looking back on that, which is skewing.
B, because we're still going on the list of three things.
Oh, sorry.
No, don't be. This is why we're doing this. B, a change that would occur. A change that would alter known history. That's why a lot of those things we don't count in this particular part of the subgenre, because, I mean, you could tell me an alternate history about a fictional nation, and that doesn't mean anything. You know, we have to know that these things happened and anchored in our reality for us to not only care, but for that to execute the requirements of the genre. And then C, it has to be an examination of the ramifications of that alteration, which is my favorite part, the world building. This is how we got here as it is today. Occasionally, some types of this kind of genre fiction are misidentified as alternate history. Specifically, sci-fi, because sci-fi, like we were talking about, that's set in the future for the writer and audience, but is now the past for people like us, like, for instance, 2001, 1984, things like that, because the authors didn't alter the real history of the past when they wrote that. They were speculating about the future. You know, of course, like we said, some alternative history deal with the tropes of time travel between histories, which that's an interesting one too, because time travel between histories can still work in the mainline subgenre we're talking about if that time travel doesn't have anything to do with the divergence or the alteration that created the new reality. if we're just doing it as an observer, like a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, even though that's not history because that's King Arthur's thing is we've talked about that a lot during our Excalibur episode. It's all over the place. But that kind of thing does kind of count sometimes. We're just observing what did and could have happened, which also they do in a lot of many worlds scenarios or, multiverse ideas.
Yeah. Which is also something we covered.
Yes, we did. We have also covered multiple. Well, we wouldn't be a good geek podcast had we not. So the awareness of the existence of an alternate universe by the inhabitants of another universe leans more into your point that that's more the setting than it is the plot or the pivot point of the narrative you're telling. Like when they time travel divides into various time streams and we're looking back on them. It's a different part of the genre, though completely valid. Like DC Comics Armageddon 2001, for instance.
The thing everybody knows.
Hey, if they're listening to this, they're gonna, because we have talked about that as well. There's a lot of things that make that subgenre diverge from the mainline subgenre, but here are the things that can happen that don't mean they diverge from it. It doesn't have to spell out the exact point in which things diverged. You don't necessarily need to know, though I prefer knowing because that's how I build the world. That's how I try and figure out the levers and the mechanisms that led us to the new alternate version of reality, but you don't actually have to know. And a lot of them don't tell you right off the bat. Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle. There's a lot of speculation about what the turning point in history is, and I think, at least based on the Amazon series, which was good in its first season and then god-awful after that, there is a pivot point in history. They don't make a big deal about it. I think I know what it is, but it's not really the point of the book. It's just, this is all you need to know, essentially. Also, these kinds of stories don't necessarily have to have just one point of divergence, which is kind of part of the appeal of the entire genre. If one event occurs and then things are different, obviously there's going to be an infinite number of pivot points from each of those cascading events afterward. You could have many points of divergence from history. It's not one of those things where it's like, oh, events in time are immutable, so even if JFK lived, we still got out of the Cold War and Reagan still existed and history's greatest monster and all that. But there could be several different pivot points that you could go down. And it also doesn't have to deal with large world-changing events. It could just be like in, and I know this is fiction, that it doesn't really fit into the genre necessarily, but in the DC Comics Elseworlds, The Nail, all of their history was changed. There is no Superman because the Kents run over a nail in the road and never find Clark. That kind of thing. It doesn't have to be dropping the A-bomb. It can be something as mundane as dropping a pencil at the right time or something, which actually is fascinating to me because a lot of events in history would have been changed by random close events like that. I'm pretty sure this is what the actual event that changes history in Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle. There was an assassination attempt on FDR by a German national. He actually got a shot off, but managed to hit the guy that was standing next to FDR. It was because he was short and had to stand on a box and look over the crowd, and so he couldn't aim properly. But if he had been just a little luckier, FDR would have died. We arguably wouldn't have gotten out of the Depression when we did. We would not have entered World War II when we did. We would not have armed Europe in fighting Hitler before we entered the war like we did. And the course of human history is completely different. Or take Hitler. When Hitler did the putsch on the beer hall, there were people waiting for the brown shirts to show up. They had a firefight, and a guy that was standing next to Hitler took a bullet that was meant for Hitler. If that hadn't happened, there would be no Hitler. Fascism may have fizzled out in Europe. We don't know. But it was just move an inch one way or the other, and the world is a completely different place.
Which is what this whole thing's about.
Exactly. And also, this genre doesn't have to deal with famous people. It could be a nobody. It could be a fictional person. It doesn't really matter. And it also doesn't have to be written in one style. It doesn't have to be sci-fi. It doesn't have to be hard historical fiction either.
All right. If it is slightly in the future, should that really change the entire genre?
Now you're dealing with a subgenre we call future history, which is like 2001. Based on things that are happening today, you're speculating on how things unfold in the near future, which is a subgenre of this subgenre, but isn't the main vein of what we're discussing, I don't think.
No, that feels more in line with a further delineation of speculative fiction rather than alternative history.
Right. Because you could consider Kirkman's The Walking Dead, because whenever the zombie outbreak happens, it's essentially now, or whatever it was. And then you follow along an alternate history of what's happening now, but the jumping off point starts at current time instead of up to current time. I think that's a big differential between those concepts, right?
Yes, but telling the same story where it started 5 years ago and the story is current, as opposed to it'll happen next month and the story is happening 5 years from now, but it's the exact same story without any other alterations, it begins to feel pretty arbitrary at that point.
Well, except for the fact that that actually bolsters what you said earlier about how, at that point, it's not about the divergent timeline. That's just the setting, which is, I think, a big difference, because the driving narrative, the driving factors for this particular subgenre, like the heart of it, the change in timeline is the point most of the time. And there are plenty of gray areas.
Right.
Even some of the most popular examples of this have weird gray areas where you're kind of like, is it this or is it that? I mean, but that's how all genre works, which is why we're here to explain it to you.
Which is why I also think it is more about the speculation. Zombies arrive, what happens then, rather than here's the history of mankind over the past 50 years because zombies arrived then.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, because then you can make an argument about World War Z. But at the same time, we're not talking about Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, where all of the world's events still happened, but there's a secret history. That is another subgenre of this.
Right.
There is a secret history revealed to the audience about these things that we didn't know were happening, but it just changes our perception of the events, but not the events themselves. Right. I know, we're in the weeds. I told you these weeds are tall, man. And not in the tall grass by Stephen King.
This field doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, we'll get into some other further examples that will examine things.
So let's start off with some of the basics. The best known current examples of alternate history are probably things like The Man in the High Castle or Fatherland by Robert Harris, which are very similar stories.
And I think really ring with one of the big flashpoints, I think, of alternate history stories, World War II and Nazism.
Absolutely.
I think this is the crux for a lot of people's storytelling. Who wins that war and how that changes things.
I've made this argument before, but I think it is the most pivotal point in human history because it is the first time things are affected on a global scale and not over a long period of time, and could so very easily have gone different directions. If Operation Valkyrie had worked, things would have been different. Had Dunkirk failed, things would have been different. If Trinity hadn't panned out, if Heisenberg hadn't sabotaged his own laboratory when he was working on an atomic bomb for the Nazis, would they have gotten it first, then the world would have been completely different because now all of the governments on the planet would have fallen under the rule of fascism.
Yeah.
And it's so many little things could have happened to have changed the world entirely overnight. I think why it's one of the more popular in that genre. Not only did people we know live through it, not only are we still seeing the ramifications of it, but it was the first time that one event or two events or tiny things could have literally changed the entire world.
I also think it helps that Nazis have become this universally antagonistic monster force that it's so easy to position them as the antagonist of any story, and seeing them win, it's such a fascinating dichotomy in storytelling. When you deal with other, say, alternate history stuff, let's say the Confederacy wins or is recognized, or the rebellion of the colonies goes differently, or changes in European history. It's such further back, less rigid details coloring those versions of those people and those groups. But the Nazis, they're so bold and so monolithically envisioned in our pop culture psyche. It's so easy to use them as this fulcrum of history.
Yes, and I think they're uniquely set up that way. That's why World War II is also really fascinating, because it is objectively the only just war ever fought. Politics be damned, the fascists were objectively evil, which I don't even believe in evil, but I mean, like, if you could categorize it any way, they were objectively evil, and they would have wrought evil upon the world. During the Cold War, when it's like we villainize the Soviet Union, in the U.S. is really awful throughout the 20th century after World War II, that we consider ourselves bastions of democracy, even though we're basically the villains. It's not as great. The Nazis were evil.
Well, I think
Their movement was evil.
in the totality of human history, I wouldn't say what the Nazis did is drastic different than what the conquistadors did to South America.
Oh, no, but Spain was worse. They killed way more people.
Right, but they aren't as universally hated.
And a lot of that's propaganda.
Well,
though.
that's
Let's be
what I'm
honest.
saying. It's time. The winners smoothing over all of that, painting over those edges of the horrors that they did. The Nazis lost, and so they get to forever be the evil of humanity. This is not pro-Nazi.
No.
Throughout history, there are many, many people just as evil, vile, horrific, and prolific in rape, murder, torture, and genocide as the Nazis, but a lot of those either won or they're kind of so far outside of the scope of Western European history that they aren't really given much notice. Pol Pot, for example. Yes, Pol Pot isn't looked at the same way as the Nazis. Do you know what I'm saying?
Sure. But Pol Pot was also not going to take over the entire world.
No, that's true. But I think a lot of what the British Empire did, the Spain,
France, Belgium.
Yeah.
They were all the colonial powers were awful. Yeah, terrible people who did terrible things. And they did take over the world.
and they did. And they get to write the history books and they get to say, oh, what we did is for the betterment of mankind and history and art, philosophy. It's good that we murdered entire races of human beings.
Columbus landing on the shores when he did that one day
The Bahamas.
changed the course of human history forever.
It did. I also think that the fact that it was during a world war, everybody was involved. Everyone.
in the
So
world.
it affected everyone.
Every continent except for Antarctica was involved in this war.
And even
Probably
even
Antarctica.
Schwabenland and
Well, and that's where the hole to the inner Earth was that Hitler was looking for. So.
yeah, we know about General Byrd, man. We're on top of this.
We know about the lizard people. Where's David Icke? They get David Icke on the phone. I have a red phone under.
He stopped returning our calls years ago.
If David Icke doesn't return my calls, we have hit rock bottom, my friend.
It's a presidential face, but you lift it up and it's actually like a lizard underneath, and you've got to press one of his red eyes, and that's what makes the phone.
Well, it's either that or it's just like a Garfield phone or like one of those hamburger phones, because that's how much credibility David Icke has. Yeah, he ruined the world too, by the way.
The problem was he used to be fun, but then people started believing him.
You can tell he was riffing. He didn't have an overarching philosophy. He wanted to be a contrarian.
Yeah.
And
He saw what was selling, and that was lizard people, and so he just
yep.
went all in on that.
He's very Alex Jones. We should do David Icke another day. That's a lizard of a different color. So in things like the Man High Castle or Fatherland, the starting point, specifically, let's say in Man of the High Castle, we talked about that. Yeah, obviously the Germans and the Japanese win World War II. And that results in Man of the High Castle, specifically the bifurcation of the North American continent, where it's split up a la Germany after our World War II into one run by one power and
Well,
then one run by the other. That ends up being
Aren't
a
there
Cold
kind of
War.
like three? Because there's the Japanese, Italy gets a little bit.
Well, it depends on if you're talking about the show or the book, because they're a little different. Unfortunately, so like the show is good because it actually fleshes the world out
Right.
more, but then eventually it just stops making sense, and they flesh all this stuff out, but they don't tell you how they got there, which is the most fun part about alternate history. I want to know how you got there. Okay, here's a good example. Let's run this down. This is what always fascinates me about it. So, in the way that things really panned out, Prince Edward?
1894 to 1972.
Yes. Okay, so King Squidward, leading up to World War II, fell for an American aristocrat, and I believe because she was divorced, was forced to abdicate the throne, which everyone, for some reason, I was watching a Seinfeld episode earlier today where they talked about how romantic that was, but except for the fact that Edward was a Nazi sympathizer and had been in touch with the Nazis during his pseudo-voluntary exile to the United States. In case the UK had fallen to the Nazis, he would be installed back as king, as essentially a puppet figurehead for the Axis powers. I think the negotiation was something like, the British can still claim their independence and their empire would continue unabated, but the figurehead would be in line with the Nazis, instead of just taking over, getting rid of the royal family, and becoming the Nazi island of Britain or whatever. That really happened. He did do that. I want to know more about that. I want to know what their deal was. I want to know what the plan was. Had the US not entered the war when they did, the UK, how long do they hold out? What's their logistical situation? How do they arm themselves? Like, how long can they last without the backup of the US armaments? I want to know, does Edward take power? Does he embrace Nazism? How does that shape up the rest of Europe? What happens to Elizabeth and that part of the family? Those are some of the tiny things I would like to know based on, I want that world to be built. And unfortunately, in the show Man in the High Castle, they give you a little bit more, but they don't tell you how or why. There's a scene where, in the first season, where Hitler's looking at the world map, it's the 60s now, and everything is divided up between either Japan and the Nazis, and you can see on the map who's controlled by whom. So, like, it's really easy to just go, like, well, you put a swastika here, you put a rising sun here, and now we know who's controlled by whom. But why? How did you get there? Because, for instance, what about Canada? What about Mexico? Mexico decided to be neutral in World War II. And in our reality, the Nazis tried to get Mexico to fight the US to keep them busy for either the Japanese invasion or to keep them out of the European theater. They just didn't bite on it. So if things went a little differently, for one reason or another, what does Mexico do? Do they let the Nazis or the Japanese use the southern border to invade the U.S. mainland? Do they stand up against Hitler, which I doubt? There are so many things based on just stuff that we know that I think are really fascinating, crazy world building, and questions we want to know about. In the Man of the High Castle show, they just show you that map and that's it. So more than the book, which gives you some details, they give you more of an idea how the world is, but not why or how we got there.
Man in the High Castle was just a book, and a fairly short book at that.
Basically a novella, yeah.
As opposed to many of these others, someone will get to like a Harry Turtledove, who's like, I'd say like the guy in alternate histories. He'll pick an idea and he'll do, 6 books on that particular world and how it develops and whatnot. You need that time and space to really flesh all of those things out, as opposed to, Man in the High Castle, where it's really kind of about a personal story and how they're in this world, this alternate history world, but it can't focus much on the totality of the historical events that are the precursors laid out.
No, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up Turtledove because he's probably the author I've read the most in this genre, but even he, who is probably like the archetypal author for this, also is kind of hit and miss with sticking to the the premise.
I think he, and probably because he's written so many of these different series that kind of focus on alternative history, because I believe that he was a professor or he got his studies in Byzantine history and whatnot.
Which is funny because he only writes 1 or 2 books set in the Byzantine era, but yeah.
I think he has books like, let's see, his Southern Victory series, which is essentially like the South wins and the Union accepts Southern independence, and that is your deviation. Where does the world progress past that? Right?
Right.
It's another one of those popular fulcrums of alternative history storytelling. But his other one, say his World War series, which is it's set during World War II, and instead of, the Nazis win or the Japanese take, or the Russia does XYZ, it's aliens show up.
Yeah.
And invade during the World War.
And then they all have to band together.
And then the race controls most of the world. And then it becomes a story about humanity versus this race, how they take over, and humanity's trying to fight them off. And then how ginger is a drug to these aliens. And it makes their reptile women really horny. And there's ginger epidemics where they're just doing too much drugs, which leads to the downfall of this alien society trying to take over. I don't know, all kind of crazy stuff.
Yeah. The exception that proves the rule. I mean, it's like, it's kind of like They Might Be Giants, the ultimate geek rock band that doesn't belong in the genre.
Yeah. Another example that it toes the line, it's his Atlantis series,
Oh boy, yeah.
Which essentially it posits that Atlantis is a real landmass that persists to this day. People only found it during like the 15th century, and then it kind of plays out throughout the books, it being colonized and fought over, really kind of like a little tiny America, because it follows that progression of the colonists then rebel and they form their own union, etc., etc. It plays out like other alternative history stories, but it's about a fictional land. Where does it really fit? I mean, obviously it's speculative fiction,
Right.
but it's not trying to do any of like other sci-fi tropes, really. And it's doing a version of alternate history, but it's an alternate fake history for a place that doesn't exist.
Right, which is not the same thing, right? I mean, you would think that's not really...
I wouldn't think. I mean, I think it's hovering in that it's scratching a similar itch.
It's funny that you brought that up, too, because I've read a fuck ton of Harry Turtledove. Well, a lot of it I've listened to in audiobook format, but the one where where the aliens invade, and I started listening to it, and I'm like, I don't like you at all. It's a different type, it's a different part of the subgenre, and it has its place, but it's not the same thing, which is funny because he's the GOAT at this point of alternate history, you know?
Again, he's the guy for this genre, but he also has multiple book series where magic exists. He has multiple time travel, parallel timelines interacting and doing things.
Yep, the exception that proves the rule. That's exactly what it is. I literally just pulled up Audible and I typed in alternate history. One of the first things to pop up as people search for Harry Turtledove.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and there are some others, obviously, many others, but he's maybe the most prolific. He's sort of like the, the Grisham or the Danielle Steele of alternate history. He's got 10,000 books out there, and I don't know how physically you can... It's kind of like when Wilt Chamberlain talked about how he slept with 10,000 women. How is that physically possible?
Yeah, how many women are you literally sleeping with every single day?
Every second of every day. I mean, you'd have to be... I remember when he talked about that, somebody actually went out of their way to break down the numbers on that, and it was like, he would have to be sleeping with 12 women a day till like 10 years after he died. It may not be the case, but...
A little hyperbolic.
Maybe a tiny bit hyperbolic. It's hard to tell, really, though. Yeah, I mean, that's a good example. Just like Turtledove, you've got guys like Robert Conroy, who was a professor at Macomb Community College, taught...
Make him great.
Make him... Mm-hmm. Make him... Hook 'em horns! I don't know. The stuff that he's written is mostly based on... And I like his work because it's based on specific pivotal moments. And not in a dumb way. He goes out of his way at the beginning of most of his books to tell you, this is what happened in this very specific period of time. This happened, but this could have happened based on reality. Like, for instance, one of his books is about how the original plan for the bombing of Pearl Harbor involved a second wave. They were apprehensive, so they nixed the bombings. The second wave of bombings would have taken out all the munitions and all the fuel, instead of just taking out boats and planes that were there, which would have completely crippled the American forces in the Pacific Theater. Things would be way different, as far as how that went. So Conroy first became interested in alternate history after studying recently discovered Imperial German plans for the invasion of the United States. Now, I've actually read the book that he wrote after this. It's called 1901.
Mm-hmm.
In that one, there was a plan by Kaiser Wilhelm II to invade the United States on the East Coast. And that book, to me, is one of the things I really love about alternate history. They lay out reasons why they would have done so, that they almost did do so, and how that would have changed not only the events that happened right afterwards, but the world going forward. So, like, in that one, if I remember correctly, basically Germany was upset that the United States had just started taking colonies from Spain, like the Philippines, from themselves, so they had a presence in that part of the world with a strong navy. Germany had always had a strong army, arguably the best in Europe for over a century, but they really had kind of a shit navy. And so Wilhelm decided that he wanted to bolster the naval presence by taking stuff from the United States, including the Philippines and other things like that, and also by invading the mainland American Northeast. And I think in the book it was New York.
Yeah, I think it's Staten Island.
Staten Island, yeah. Well, so like, it could be...
Or Long Island, rather.
The idea is that his rationale in the book, I believe, is that in Europe, especially then, you kind of stole things back and forth from each other, like Alsace-Lorraine between France and Germany. You invade, you cordon off this area, and now it's theirs. Maybe they fight to take it back, kind of like what happens after the Cold War ends in Russia with Chechnya and Kosovo and that kind of thing. But in the United States, that doesn't happen. We don't function that way. If you invade the United States, you're invading the entire United States. You're not just taking a chunk of it. They tried that with Canada in 1812. That didn't work out very well for anybody. So the idea is that they invade New York or whatever, and they're like, oh, yeah, it'll be fine. But then they realize that all of America now suddenly mobilizes. Instead of waiting until World War I, now all of America mobilizes to rebel the Germans as a nation. I've read so many of these. God, I know way too much about this shit. So that's the thing about Conroy, is that he writes all these books that deal with very specific instances. But they're not all in one series. He writes books like, he wrote one called 1945, where Japan refuses to surrender after they bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Mm-hmm.
But then he also writes a book called Red Inferno 1945, where it deals with the war between Western Allies and the Soviet Union. In that one, Stalin thinks that the Allies are invading Berlin to take over Europe instead of just to topple the Nazis. So 2 books set in the same year around a series similar events that deal with 2 different divergent paths that are based on actual pivotal events that could have happened. And they're still dealing with the same concepts, just which event changed is different. And it's, you know what, it's probably boring as shit for a lot of people, and it's probably not interesting at all for most people, but I find that fascinating, personally. He wrote one called Castro's Bombs, where Castro seized control over nuclear armaments during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Oh, I've definitely read Himmler's War, which is if Hitler had been killed in 1944, and then Himmler takes over and is way worse.
Or at least is more effective.
Well, yeah, in the way that they want to be effective. Then there's like North Reich, where the UK surrenders to Germany and fascist UK is born. And then they go to war against the United States. Rising Sun, where the Japanese win at Midway. Or one of my favorite ones, actually, 1920, America's Great War, where the United States remains neutral during World War I. And then Germany takes control of almost all of Europe. But they're not Nazis, they're just the German Empire. And then Germany uses Mexico to launch an invasion against the United States because Mexico was independent through all of that stuff. Or Liberty 1784, the Second War for Independence, where the British very easily defeat the American Revolution, which they should have. So many points in which the United States, the colonies, should have lost to the UK. That one, they go to Chicago, but in one of them, they end up moving the capital to Detroit because they can go through Canada. And then, in that one, Ben Franklin invents the rapid fire handgun. That's how they end up beating the British. And, stuff that is relatively possible. Here's a good one. 1882, Custer in Chains. Not like Hercules, but
not like his revenge.
Exactly, yeah. Where he wins the Battle of Bighorn and then is elected president, which would have been a disaster because he provokes a war with Spain or whatever. Or Germanica, where Joseph Goebbels prolongs World War II by building a German fallback area in the Alps or whatever. I mean, he has so many books that are almost identical in premise, but the event that changes is different. And because of that, the entire world has changed. Mm-hmm. Which is fascinating to me, and I think the appeal of the entire genre.
Yeah, no, I think he keeps that core concept alive. Every story is just a different what if, and how this flows out of that.
Okay, it's a lot. There's a lot there.
In an alternate history, this would be the end of the whole podcast, but in reality, this is just end of part 1.
It is. Indeed.
There will be a part 2 in the near future, but until then. We'd like to thank you for listening. Please like, share, subscribe to our podcast. If you wouldn't mind giving us 5 Confederate States stars.
I don't like that at all, to be honest.
You know what? Sometimes when these just flow off the top of my head and I try to make them relevant to what we just talked about, it doesn't quite work the way I'd like.
You can't go off the Thunderdome. You gotta go.
How about give us 5 global colonies because the Aztecs took over everything and...
That'd have been so much cooler.
We'll have at least 1 or 2 stories where they are still around and prevalent and doing cool stuff.
Then you get stuff like the East of West. And we haven't even gotten to video games like Civilization or Fallout.
Fallout is a major one. I did like little Fallout mini deep dive to see what that was all about.
Good. I was hoping we'd get to it, but we're not going to get to it today.
Yeah, and I mean, I've never played Fallout, so there's such deep lore with that game.
There is.
I don't know if I'm the proper person to spout that out to you.
Hey, but we were doing a video game series, so we got to act like we know.
Sure, we totally know. Yeah,
we totally played Looks at Hand Fallout.
Wolfenstein. Yeah, but again, please rate us on there. That's how we do get seen. Wouldn't mind that. And Skip, till next time, what should they do?
We want to feel seen. Okay?
But not too
seen. Well, keeping that in mind, please pay credits to your robotic bartenders. Please clean up after yourselves to some sort of reasonable degree before the overlords do their sweep of dissidents. Please support your local whole magazine purveyors. Oh, man, I got nothing on that one. And from the War Rocket Ajax podcast, we would like to say Godspeed, fair warlock. I guess that's it. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, in this version, I don't say anything.
But that happens sometimes in our regular one.
Shut up.
You don't tell me what to do.
Feel free to throw up. I know I did.